Good morning, I'm Catherine Jones. I am one of the pediatric hospitalists in the Division of Hospitalist Medicine. And this morning I will be here talking to you about drowning prevention and non-critical management. This is an important topic, especially during these warmer months coming up. And I just want to give everyone a heads up, there are some difficult stories and some difficult images that will be coming up in these slides. I have no financial disclosures. So I want to take a moment to talk about my why. In this picture, I'm the one in the middle there. My older brother is the one on the left. And then my 22-month-old brother, Nicholas, is the one on the right. And we are in a family pool in this picture. A couple weeks later, Nicholas ended up under the water at the pool. There were multiple adults and kids outside around the pool present, but he wasn't seen for several minutes. Ultimately ended up getting pulled out by one of the other children in the pool. CPR was attempted at the scene. He was taken to a small hospital up about an hour north of St. Louis, and then airlifted down to Children's, where he passed away after a week in the ICU. So it's been something that was a long time ago, obviously, but it's been something that's been central to our family ever since. So hopefully none of you have an experience that's quite this personal, but as pediatricians, this is sort of your why. Drowning is the leading cause of death, leading cause of injury death in children ages 1 to 4. It is the third leading injury cause of death in older children ages 5 to 19. And there were nearly 14,000 drowning deaths in children 19 and under between 1999 and 2010. And what's so devastating about this is that these are truly preventable deaths. Virtually none of these had to happen. This is our chance to make a difference by trying to prevent these from happening in the first place. So today I'm going to take a few minutes to go through some additional background and statistics. I'm going to review some strategies for evidence-based prevention. And then I'm going to take a few minutes at the end to talk about pathophysiology and management, not of the truly critical kids, but of the kids who might show up in the office or questions that you might get or see. By the time these kids get to the ICU, usually, unfortunately, not that much can be done. So really prevention is where we as physicians can make a big impact and have a big difference. So for the definition for drowning, this was revised back in 2002 by the World Congress on Drowning, as well as the WHO. And the definition is the process of experiencing respiratory impairment from submersion or immersion in liquid. And then it's classified either as death, morbidity, or no morbidity. In the past, people use the term near drowning to refer to an episode where the child did not die at the moment of the submersion, but that term has fallen out of favor. So this next graph is from the CDC, and it shows the typical bimodal distribution of drowning deaths. You can see similar trends across different races and ethnicities, but drowning rates are unquestionably higher for African American children. So Black children in that 5 to 19 age range drown in swimming pools 5.5 times the rate of white children. And again, that's data from the CDC. This difference is thought to be due to a number of factors, but it's thought to be due in part to lower rates of swimming competency in African American children, which has its roots back to institutional racism. Municipal pool access in the past was limited by segregation, and that's kind of led to a long-standing trend of decreased swimming in some communities. And then socioeconomic factors that may limit access to swimming pools and swimming lessons that still contribute today. Some additional data. So this sort of shows where these drownings are more likely to happen. So in young kids, it's typically bathtubs, and infants, it's typically bathtubs or water that's in the home. For toddlers, it's pools, pools, pools. Most of them were not expected, about almost 70% were not expected to be at the pool or in the pool at the time of drowning. So a lot of these are happening not during supervised swim time, but at other times where toddlers find their way into the pool. And then for adolescents, it's much more likely to be in natural water settings. And for older kids and adults, in roughly 50% of these cases, alcohol is a factor in these deaths. One other thing to note is for the younger kids, the kids under 5, 87% of drowning fatalities happen in home pools and hot tubs. And most of these are the pools these kids are in, which are the pools owned by family, friends, and relatives. So definitely those are a risk factor. Drowning events lead to about 8,700 ER visits per year. In infants, the male to female ratio is equal, but afterwards, at the age of 1, it's higher in males. Some additional risk factors, so epilepsy, obviously, if the child were to have a seizure in water, that could be catastrophic, and so these kids need extremely diligent supervision around water, and life jackets are all the more critical for these kids. Autism we'll talk about in a little bit, but that definitely increases the risk substantially. And then for cardiac arrhythmias, so there's sort of 2 factors. There's the one that if a kid is at risk for cardiac arrhythmia, that could certainly happen in the water, and that would obviously be problematic. But then swimming and diving can actually precipitate these arrhythmias, so it's a higher risk of going into the arrhythmia than even their baseline risk would be out of the water. Things that we worry about here are things like long QT, Brugada, and these sorts of things that can lead to cardiac arrhythmias that can decrease the level of consciousness in the water. So I want to take a few more minutes to talk about autism. So these kids are 160 times more likely to drown, which is a pretty stunning statistic. Many of these kids will wander outside the home, and about 50% of parents, autistic spectrum kids, report that they don't get advice from their pediatrician about wandering. So this is definitely something when you see these patients in your office to discuss with these families who are impacted by this. So causes of death in children 1 to 4 years of age. And this is data from the CDC and just shows you that drowning compares similarly to MVCs and other causes of unintentional injury deaths. We do spend a lot of time talking with families about car seats and car seat safety, which is appropriate, obviously, with these statistics. But then it just sort of highlights to me that it's important to also address water safety and drowning risk with these families because they're sort of have a similar order of magnitude in terms of the frequency of these issues. So these families are a couple of families I want to talk about as water safety advocates. Given the drowning numbers in the past, the AAP had been less focused on the issue of water safety than one might expect. And then there were these 2 families that kind of really got involved in the advocacy for water safety. On the left, it's Olympic skier Bodie Miller. His daughter, Emmy, drowned in 2018 in their family pool when she was 18 months old. And on the right is the Hughes family. They were on a vacation, and their son, Levi, in this picture, had slipped away for a few minutes, and it had been such a short period of time that his mom had actually shared like a brownie or a cookie with him, and she said that the bite she'd eaten was still in her mouth, so it had literally been just a couple of minutes. He was found in the pool outside their vacation rental, and the dad actually is an anesthesiologist and was with his anesthesiology friends, so they were able to intubate him prior to EMS arriving, and obviously start high quality CPR. Despite that, he was pronounced dead upon arrival to the hospital, so even with the high quality interventions at the pool side. And both these families have gotten, again, very involved in this water safety advocacy, and actually in part because of their efforts, the AAP has really kind of refocused on the issue of water safety in recent years. Both of these families did feel that, they went to all of their well child checks and they, read all the handouts they got, and they felt like they hadn't seen much, if anything, on water safety. It's not meant to be a critical thing at all, but just as a reminder of the importance of going through this with families to, these infants and young toddlers about the risks and how to prevent these bad outcomes. And again, since then, the AAP has really refocused on this issue. So I want to talk about evidence-based prevention. I think we're probably all familiar with the Swiss cheese model with layers of prevention. This is where we as providers can truly have the biggest impact. You may not know which kid you save, but you can have an impact and reduce drownings and make a lifelong difference to families whose kids who did save. Each layer is important. Each layer offers some measure of protection, but no layer of protection is perfect. So kind of the more layers you have, the less likely you are to have a situation where they all fail and a bad outcome occurs. And then so we'll talk about barriers to the water, supervision, swim lessons, using life jackets, lifeguards, and CPR, which are the AAP recommended layers of protection. So for barriers, the most critical thing here is that they are on all 4 sides of the pool. So many home pools are open to the house on one side, which is legal from a zoning standpoint, but obviously presents a huge safety risk. And this is from the Cochrane database about looking at how to keep these as safe as possible. Of note, zoning laws generally do require, again, that they be fenced. But they also, in the area, most municipalities actually have laws that require that any doors or windows that open to the pool have an alarm. This is probably not something that's closely enforced, but something to be aware of. For families who have a pool that opens to the house, but maybe have a young child and they don't want to install permanent fencing right outside their back door, there are mesh fences that are meant to be child safe. And so families can do that as a temporary thing while they have these young children to add that extra layer of safety. The image here shows a self-closing and self-latching gate. These are also typically required in most municipalities around here as a safety measure around the pool. Obviously having this and just have it be a default that the gate to the pool is closed makes a difference. And then for families with kids with autism spectrum disorders, it may take a little bit more advocacy. It's going to be more about looking at what the risks are in your local community and then advocating with the community and working with the community to create safety measures around these hazards. So here's an image of the mesh safety fencing that I talked about. And again, it's designed to be tall enough and strong enough, and then with small enough gaps that it can safely keep the little ones out of the pool area. I also want to take a little bit of time to talk about above ground pools, which I know got really popular during the pandemic. So most people might not know that even these pools, as long as they're 18 to 24 inches deep, they typically have the same fencing requirements as do hot tubs and spas and other waters. So it's not just the in-ground pools that families need to worry about. So for supervision, when we talk about supervision, this is not, rocket science here, but the supervision should be close, constant, and attentive. We went to a pool party not so long ago where there were a bunch of kids in the pool and there were tons of floats in the pool. And, all these kids were in the pool and you just couldn't see anybody because there were so many floats in the pool. So you want a situation where you can have direct line of sight with the child. For kids who are non-swimmers and beginning swimmers, we want to be within arm's reach, so touch supervision. For older children, they should still be constantly watched, so often designating someone as the water watcher who's responsible, and making sure that person stays off their phone, which is really one of the bigger risks now, is that people are distracted by their phone. You want to have kids avoid hyperventilation and breath holding. Sometimes kids will hyperventilate, which will lower their partial pressure of CO2. That enables them to do prolonged breath holding underwater, since that inspiratory drive is triggered by the partial pressure of CO2. But you can actually, during that time that you're breath holding, your oxygen concentration is dropping lower and lower. There are cases where people have blacked out and drowned from getting too little oxygen while they were still able to voluntarily hold their breath. And then the key thing is, so many people think that they will see or hear a kid who's drowning. And drowning is silent and drowning is fast. And we actually had something that was a little bit scary not so long ago, about a month ago. We were at a hotel pool. I was watching our 2 kids, and there was another family with 3 kids at the other end of the pool. And all of a sudden I heard one of the other kids yelling, and her younger sister had gone under and wasn't able to resurface. So the older sister grabbed her and pulled her out, and she was okay, thankfully. But it was something that had happened in a fairly small pool. I was, directly supervising the pool, and still it happened totally without I don't think I would have detected it had this sister not noticed that her younger sister had gone under. So this is just another reinforcement of that. It's a video which I would recommend to families that have pools and young kids. It's pretty brutal to watch, but you can Google it as a series of events. It's a little bit grainy because this is from the security footage from the pool. But basically, this was at a pool party at a community pool, and the parents of one of the children had said to the host family that their child wasn't a strong swimmer. And just to give you your bearings, the orange arrow represents a lifeguard who's on duty, actively watching the pool. The yellow arrow is the host parent who had been poolside for a while, but then ended up getting in the hot tub. And the red arrow is a child who had the child who was not a great swimmer, who had been swimming in the pool using a flotation device, and he fell off the flotation device and went under. And you can watch for 4.5 minutes while this child is under the water with numerous adults around and a lifeguard supervising the pool, and nobody has noticed that he's gone under and is unable to resurface. Thankfully, he was brought out and resuscitated and survived, but did have long-term sequelae from that submersion injury. And again, this is a pool that you can obviously see is filled with many people who didn't see or hear anything. So prior to the AAP, prior to 2010, the AAP didn't feel that they had enough evidence to really strongly recommend swim lessons for kids under 4. Since then, evidence has been accumulating showing that swim lessons in these younger kids do help prevent drownings. So there was a case control study that showed an 88% reduction in the risk of drowning for these 1 to 4-year-old children who have participated in formal swim lessons. Did have large confidence intervals, obviously not an easy thing to study. But the evidence suggests that starting at age 1, swim lessons reduce the risk of drowning, and this is something to recommend to families. The AAP recommends that older kids 4 and up, they're definitely ready to learn to swim and should, and so they should learn basic water survival and swimming skills. And if they haven't already learned to swim, they should definitely be in lessons at that time. I want to take a moment to talk about ISR, which stands for the Infant Swimming Resource Classes. These are classes with really little kids, often 6 months old, where they teach the kid to, if they go into water unexpectedly, turn over on their back and float, and then get to the side of the pool sometimes. Right now, the AAP does not recommend these activities. There's not enough evidence for them. They're often referred to as drown-proofing classes, which obviously is a term that may lead to complacency if families have a pool and their family and kids have been through this. So if you do have families that choose to participate, you want to make sure that they recognize that it is, potentially just one layer of protection, but that they shouldn't lower their guard with all the other layers of protection. And the AAP's recommendations, if you're going to start some sort of swim lesson with kids that age, just doing water play so that kids get used to being in the water, so that then when they're a little bit older, 1 and up, they can start lessons and be more comfortable. So the AAP does recommend that swim lessons include some of these water survival and safety skills. So things like, one of the biggest ones is just learning to flip onto their back and float. Because if they do that, they can breathe until they get identified by an adult. Also practicing on ending up in the water unexpectedly, because that can obviously throw kids off. So some groups of lessons will actually have kids practice going in the water fully clothed so they can get used to that experience as opposed to just being in swimwear. So for water safety skills, the American Red Cross recommends that all swimmers be able to pass a 5-point safety checklist. So they should be able to jump or step into water that's over their head. They should be able to get back to the surface and either float or tread for a full minute. They should be able to turn around in the pool and then find the exit from the pool. They should be able to swim at least 25 yards without stopping. And then they should be able to exit the pool at the side or exit the water without a ladder in the pool to do that safely. And remarkably, only 56% of Americans can perform all of these skills. So life jackets, you want to make sure families are using Coast Guard approved life jackets. Thankfully, these puddle jumpers have gotten, the puddle jumpers on the left have gotten popular in recent years. Those are Coast Guard approved PFDs. We really want to avoid floaties or anything inflatable. These can obviously deflate. The floaties can slip down the arm And they can provide parents and children with a false sense of security, where the kids might go in the water that's too deep or otherwise feel safer than they should for their level of swimming. And then really everyone who's in or on watercraft should be wearing a life jacket. 80% of boating fatalities that happen on water, the victim was not wearing a life jacket. So many of these would have been preventable with life jackets. So lifeguards are definitely an added layer of protection, but the key thing is that they do not replace parental supervision. So just because there's a lifeguard doesn't mean the parent can be reading their phone or reading a book or sleeping at the side of the pool. Anyone who's got kids has been to different pools, and some lifeguards are sort of a layer of protection, more like the slice on the left there, where I've had lifeguards who are just actively walking down. You can see them constantly scanning the pool, taking engaged measures. I've also been at pools where the lifeguard is reading their phone, so so it can be a variable layer of protection. But again, we should just always remind families that they do not replace that parental supervision. For CPR, really everyone should learn CPR, but anyone with a pool and parents and caregivers should learn CPR. And the immediate resuscitation of kids prior to the arrival of EMS does improve outcomes with a pretty significant odds ratio. That includes both death, but also looking at significant neurologic injury. It's a great way for adolescents to get engaged. They can learn CPR. Most people have phones with them at this point, but also making sure that you have rescue equipment kept poolside that's accessible if you need it in an emergency. So then I want to just talk about a few additional layers of protection. These are not in the AAP guidelines. There are pool covers and pool alarms. Some of these pool covers are designed to handle people walking on them, so they're pretty strong when installed. There's just, at this point, the AAP feels like there's not enough data to make a definitive statement. There are also door alarms that you can put on a door if it gets open, making sure families know even small sources of water, so buckets, kiddie pools, should all be emptied immediately after use. If you have an above ground pool, remove that ladder between uses so that it's less accessible to toddlers. And then also, potentially in the bathroom with toilets, or if a kid were to run a bath or something, you want to consider toilet locks and not leaving kids alone in the bathroom. All these things are probably helpful as long as they aren't there to replace other layers of protection, and as long as they don't lead to complacency with families. So the AAP has some great infographics on water safety and pool safety, and that you can easily access for handouts for families and that sort of thing. So this goes through pool safety for young kids. It talks about swimming lessons. Again, it talks about pool covers and door alarms, our potential additional layers of protection, making sure that the toys are out of the pool so that a toddler is not tempted to go in after something, and also to improve visibility. And then, again, it talks about fencing, making sure that if they have a pool, that there's fencing separating the pool from the house. They also have this that goes kind of by different ages and stages. And so it talks about appropriate water safety for each age of child. So in the younger kids, more about buckets, bathtubs, and pool safety, making sure to have locked gates. And then as you get older, it has additional safety recommendations that are age appropriate. So I want to take a little bit of time to talk about Water Smart Babies. This is a program that was initially piloted down in Florida, which because of the warm weather year round and the ocean, and many people have pools, has a very high rate of drowning. So the program was basically just to have pediatricians take a few moments to discuss water safety with families and give them a handout, and then sign a little thing that sort of quote prescribes swim lessons at these 9 and 12-month visits. And it led to a 50% reduction in drownings in the young kids in the first year of the program. It was then expanded to Arizona. They saw similar results. So it definitely saved lives. So this is the handout that they have, and the prescription. Basically, it's just a chance to sort of talk through these 4 goals of doing swim lessons, providing touch supervision, putting in alarms and fencing, and learning CPR. And then there's the handout to give to families, so it doesn't take more than a minute or 2 to go through with them. And then it has some additional information about safety. It goes through the basics of CPR for families, and then has just a very simple water safety checklist for these families. So back in 2018, there was a survey of about 300 families, and 60% of these said that their pediatrician had not talked with them about water safety. And I think the data from Water Smart Babies really shows that just a simple, brief discussion with these families about water safety at these sort of 9 and 12-month visits as kids are becoming mobile and more curious can have a measurable impact on drownings. I also want to take a few minutes to talk about drain entrapment, which can lead to some pretty gruesome injuries. Kids should be instructed to just stay away from pool drains. So hair entrapment can lead to drowning if the kid gets stuck under the water. And there are cases where there's been a kid who sits on a drain just in a kid pool and resulting in evisceration. So there is a law, the Virginia Graham-Baker law in 2008 has legally required pools to have safer drains. But older pools may not have these safety drains, or they can become damaged or dislodged, or pools may not be up to code. So in general, a flat drain is the kind you don't want. These ones that kind of stick out, you can see, are typically the safety drains. And then I want to take a little bit of time now to kind of shift gears and talk some about the pathophysiology. So typically what happens in a drowning is there's panic and breath holding in response to submersion, which eventually progresses to air hunger and just a reflex inspiration when you get to the point where you can't hold that breath anymore. And then one of two things can happen. You can either have hypoxemia through aspiration, or when that water hits the vocal cords, you can have a reflex laryngospasm, which can also lead to hypoxemia. In the past, it was thought that salt water and fresh water had a different pathophysiology. It was thought that salt water was hypertonic, and so that would pull plasma into the pulmonary interstitium, leading to pulmonary edema and hypertonic serum. Whereas fresh water obviously is going to be hypotonic, and so fluid would pass rapidly into the lungs, into the intravascular compartment, which could lead to volume overload and hypotonic serum. And this was seen to some extent in people who had died from drowning, but it was found that that difference really only applied to patients who were dead upon arrival at the hospital. And basically, in order to have these significant physiologic differences between salt water versus fresh water, people needed to ingest a large volume of water, much larger than would be typically present in a child who presents to the hospital. So 11 mils per kilogram for blood volume changes, 22 mils per kilogram for electrolyte changes, whereas most non-fatal drowning victims have no more than 4 mils per kilogram of water that they've aspirated. For non-fatal drownings, that will result in decreased lung compliance. They can have VQ mismatch, intrapulmonary shunting, and then all of these can result in hypoxemia. So that aspirated water can wash out the surfactant, which can then lead to pulmonary edema and ARDS for these kids who get really sick with it. Typically, they'll present with shortness of breath, they'll have crackles and wheezing, and it's critical to know this can have an insidious presentation. So they may have imaging and presentation that's normal, or may have varying degrees of pulmonary edema, but it's not necessarily how they are when they first present. Is not necessarily the picture they'll be in several hours. So next, I want to talk a little bit about management. Ventilation of these kids, as with so many things, is the top priority. This should begin as soon as possible. So if a kid is in shallow water, or as soon as they're on a stable surface. One thing to note is that cervical spine injury is rare, unless there are signs of trauma or an obvious high-risk mechanism. So if a kid, dove into the water and then is not coming up, that's one thing. But there's one study that looked at over 2,000 submersion victims, and only 1 out of 200, 0.5% of them had any kind of C-spine injury, and all of those who did had clear signs of injury and a concerning mechanism. So it wasn't, just a kid who's found floating in the water, a toddler. Typically, it's not a major worry. So it's not recommended unless you have some suspicion. It's not recommended to try to have C-spine mobilization. Obviously, that can make successful resuscitation more difficult, and in most of these cases, resuscitation is the more critical piece. In TV shows, you'll see people doing Heimlich or postural drainage. All these do and delay the care that the kids need and are of no proven value. So again, patients who are going to become symptomatic will generally become symptomatic in these first 7 hours. So if you have a kid who comes into the ER or a family that's worried, you want to monitor them for until their symptoms fully resolve. In the ER, if a kid comes in, you may obtain an EKG or a BMP. For older kids, if relevant, you can get drug scans. For kids where you're worried about, you could do a CBC or coags. And then really, most of these kids just need like 8 hours of observation. And then if you get a chest X-ray near the end of that observation period and that looks clear, then that can be very reassuring. There is not a role for steroids for these kids. And then in most cases, you want to avoid prophylactic antibiotics. Obviously, if there are signs of clinical infection, you want to give them, or, I had a kid in residency who had been submerged in a cow pond. So kids who are in grossly contaminated water, you could consider prophylactic antibiotics. And then if they do develop pneumonia, you want to cover for some atypical bugs, so making sure you have that pseudomonal coverage, as well as Aeromonas and Proteus. I want to take a little bit of time to talk about dry drowning and secondary drowning. I feel like these get a lot of attention on like Facebook and social media, with the idea being that a kid will, briefly be underwater, come up, cough and sputter a little, seem totally fine, and then suddenly, have respiratory failure. So for dry, they do exist as issues, but they're rare and they don't present like Facebook would, I do believe. So dry drowning is where you get water in the upper airway and then have laryngospasm. And then the idea is that then that leads to really strong negative intrapulmonary pressure, and that can cause some pulmonary edema with some delayed onset respiratory distress. Typically they'll present within the first hour after the event. And then secondary drowning is where you have aspirated water and surfactant washout, which leads to gradual pulmonary edema within 24 to 48 hours. And again, these are rare, and then symptoms progress over time. So, if you have a kid who had an event the day before and is now having some respiratory distress, you might want to think about it and worry about it, but it's not like a kid goes from being totally fine to suddenly in critical distress. So the main thing is if parents see symptoms in their kids, they can have them evaluated, but if they're asymptomatic, they can be reassured. So for outcomes, really the biggest factor is the duration of the submersion, so longer than 5 minutes. Again, this is, I want people to learn CPR, that time to initiation of CPR. Obviously, if they have a prolonged resuscitation, that leads to worse outcomes. Older kids tend to do worse, and kids with a low GCS on arrival. If they are still apneic, or if CPR is still underway in the ER, or if they're highly acidotic upon presentation, these are all not surprising indicators of more severe. And then, cold water immersion, it's not totally clear what the impact is. It seems that prolonged resuscitations may yield a better outcome if the hypothermia preceded the asphyxia for cold water immersion. But again, it's not totally clear what that impact is. So key takeaways, so drowning is a leading cause of death in children, and it is preventable. This, is something that impacts families for the rest of their lives, and every drowning you can prevent can just have a huge impact, obviously, on the kid, also their family and support network. Fences are huge for families, and making sure that fence is four-sided. Supervision, swim lesson, lifeguards, life jackets, CPR training are all evidence-based layers of protection for families. And really that you as a pediatrician can have an impact. So these brief interventions that take just a minute or two at the well child visit can reduce these childhood drowning rates and can have a real impact. So here are some of the resources that I talked about. So Water Smart Babies has some of their stuff available on their website. There's also the AAP and healthychildren.org have some of these infographics and other handouts. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. It's KG McMullin, MCMULLIN @worcester.edu. Or I'm sure you can reach me through Angela if you have any questions or any follow-up information. So thank you for your time. Please make sure to address this with families and help prevent this from happening to other families.